wisest man that ever lived? Well, today we're going to turn that around and look at a fool. In fact, the title of this parable we're going to look at in Luke 12 is called the parable of the rich fool. So we're going to go from wisdom one week to folly the next. Because in the Bible there are some people that show us how to live because of their wisdom. And there are also people who show us how to live because they were fools. And we learn from their mistakes, just like in our modern times, right? And so let's look at Luke chapter 12, beginning at verse 13. The parable doesn't begin until verse 16. But this will give us the context of what was taking place. It says that one from the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things that he possesses." Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops?' So he said, 'I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" Now make no mistake about it. This rich man was a skillful and talented individual. He knew the ins and outs of sowing and reaping. He knew how to work a field. He knew how to yield a crop. And he knew how to make money, and plenty of it. However, he did not know how to live, at least not wisely. He excelled as a businessman, but his priorities were out of order. He was a good cultivator, but a poor calculator. I spent a lot of time putting this next part together, but not really. He had loot and he had fruit, and plenty of big barns to boot. He had wealth you couldn't refute. And I'm not trying to be cute, but when it came to God, he was mute. His life had no root. Now what's interesting to me is that Jesus refers to this man as a fool. That's not a word that Jesus uses all that often. And one of the reasons why it's interesting is because this man seems to be a fairly upstanding man. As far as we know, he did no evil to others. As far as we know, he was a person who earned his wealth in a respectable way. He was a hard-working man, and to our knowledge, he had no enemies. And yet Jesus refers to him as a fool. And in looking in the New Testament, I realized that Jesus did that a couple of other times. But it's always within a parable, interestingly enough. In Matthew chapter 25, he told a parable about these 10 young women. And he said 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. And the reason that these 5 were foolish is because they did not prepare for the coming of the bridegroom. It's a parable about the second coming of Christ. And these 5 that were foolish were unprepared. The other time is in Matthew 7, when Jesus talked about a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And he said that this man was foolish because he was disobedient. And being disobedient is like building your house on a sand where eventually the foundation is going to erode and it's going to come tumbling down. And as you look at these three times in parables, Matthew 7, Matthew 25, and here in Luke 12, where Jesus refers to someone as a fool, what they have in common is that in each case, the individual who is referred to as a fool is not looking at the long term. In each case, they're not looking at the ramifications of their actions. They're only looking at the immediate. The five foolish virgins were only looking at the fun they could have in the moment. They were caught up in the here and now, and they weren't looking at the coming of the bridegroom. The man who built his house on the sand was a fool because all he was concerned about was what he wanted. He lived a disobedient life and wasn't thinking about the future and what that would entail. And here in Luke 12, as we look at this rich fool, he's thinking again about just the immediate. He's not looking about the long term. He's not thinking about the ramifications of his decisions and what this is going to mean for eternity. And so in all three cases, these three people who are referred to as fools are not thinking about eternity. They're not thinking about their soul. They're not thinking about the long term. All they're concerned about is what they can get their hands on in the immediate. All that they can get today. And I pray that that's a lesson for all of us to remember. That to focus just on today, just what we can get immediately, just what pleasures or riches or fame or honor or reputation that we can garner now, and to give no consideration to eternity is a foolish, foolish, foolish way to live. We need to take eternity in mind. That's why Paul said we don't look at the things that are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things that are not seen are eternal. Now, there are two main things I want to say about this rich fool today, and I have some thoughts concerning each one of those that I'll share with you. So I want to begin with this one, and that is that this rich fool had an idolatrous regard for the world. He had an idolatrous regard for the world. This man loved money and wealth and all that came with it. I mean, he loved the world. He loved the here and now. In fact, you could say that it was his God. It was his idol. It's what he worshiped. And you'll see that as we go on this morning, how his life was wrapped up in his wealth. And I want to attach a couple of sub-points to this, three of them actually. The first one is that this rich man wanted to have it all. He wanted to have it all. Now, I know that no one can literally have it all, right? I mean, where would you put everything, right? Nobody can have it all. But when we use that expression, you want to have it all, what that means is you want to get as much as you can. And this man wanted to get as much as he could. Whatever he could make room for. Even if it meant building bigger barns. Why, he wanted it. He wanted to have it all. And this is easy for us to fall into because we live in a culture that fosters that kind of desire. The advertisements that we see in magazines and on the television and online just holler out for us to get the best of everything, the latest technological devices. It's like if you don't drive a certain kind of vehicle, then you're not cool. And they pressure us into getting the best of everything. And if you really want to be somebody, then you got to go after it all, man. And they try to create that desire to have it all, because that then lines their pockets, you see. And so we often buy into that. Even as Christians, we can be sucked into that kind of a lifestyle. Soon the desire to have it all is replaced by the fear of losing it all. One worry replaces another. But the worst part of the idea of wanting to have it all is God gets pushed into the background. And our priorities become centered around what we have. And our focus, that is our security, what we have, our possessions, our money, everything around us. If we're not careful, if we don't have a healthy perspective of it as stewards, then those things come to define us. And then if we lose a little bit or something gets broken or stolen, well, our life just falls apart because we're wrapped up in it, because we want to have it all. A second thing about this rich man concerning his regard for the world is he wanted to hoard it all. It wasn't bad enough that he wanted to have it all, but even worse, he wanted to hoard it all. Because he gets to a point where his wealth becomes so much that he's like, oh, what am I going to do with it now? And so he decides to build bigger barns. Now, the building of bigger barns in and of itself isn't a bad thing. And that would be like you putting your money in a bank, right? It's not a bad thing on the surface. But it's his attitude about it. Because he says in verse 19, he says, I have many goods stored up for many years, so I will eat, drink, and be merry. And it's all about himself. And he just wanted to hoard it. He even asked the question, what shall I do? When his crop begins to bring so much yield, he says, what shall I do? And again, that's a good question. You know, with our funds and finances and our assets, we ought to ask that question, what shall I do? But his answer was, store it. Hold on to it. Hoard it. It never crossed his mind to consider using his wealth as an opportunity to help anyone else. It was just all about hoarding it. I just want to store it. I don't know, maybe it gave him some sense of security or pride to know that he was so wealthy, but he just wanted to hoard it. And so he built bigger barns. You know, Augustine said concerning this parable, he said, thou hast barns, they are the hands of the needy, the houses of widows, and the mouths of infants and orphans. And you catch what he's saying? He's saying you and I have barns to put our wealth into. Oh, not the literal barns that the rich man created. He said, no. He said, our barns are the hands of the needy. Put your wealth into those barns, or the houses of widows, or the mouths of infants and orphans. He said, those are our barns. And if this rich man would have chosen that approach, instead of just hoarding it, he would have been called a fool so much. At least that would have been the first step in the right direction. But he just wanted to hoard it. Made him feel good. Made him feel like a success. It filled him with pride to know that he had all this money, all these assets. But then one other thing on this particular thought is that he wanted to hold it all. Now, I want to differentiate between hoarding and holding. Hoarding, it means to store it in my mind. You know, you hoard it, you just store it for whatever purpose. But holding on to it, in my mind, thinking about this rich fool, is he wanted to have his life revolve around his money. He wanted to hold on to it and wrap his life around it. It defined who he was. You've probably heard in Greek mythology of King Midas, right? How everything he touched turned to gold. But do you know the story behind King Midas? Very interesting. In Greek mythology, King Midas had done a very favorable deed, and as a result, he was granted a wish by one named Dionysius. Well, that made the microphone sound funny. Dionysius. It's a little trick I can do. And King Midas thought about it, and he said, here's the wish I would like. I would like it to where everything I touch turns to gold. Because in his mind, he's thinking, if I could have that wish granted, I could become more wealthy than I ever imagined. And so in a moment, he was granted his wish. And it happened. He would touch a flower, and it would turn into pure gold. He touched a tree, and suddenly it had no lively branches and leaves, but it became gold. He would touch a horse, and it would turn into pure gold. And he was delighted. Within just a matter of minutes, King Midas became the richest man in all the land, by far. As the day wore on and he continued in his joy, eventually he got to a point, of course, where he got hungry, and so he went to his palace and he sat down at a banquet table. But to his shock and dismay, When he went to touch his meat on his plate, it turned into gold. When he reached for his goblet to take a drink of his wine, as soon as it touched his lips, the wine turned to gold. He slammed his goblet on the table because he was filled with frustration, because he was so hungry and he couldn't satisfy his hunger nor his thirst, because every time something would touch either his hands or his mouth or any part of him, it would become gold. The worst part came when he was talking with his daughter a little later, and he went to hug her, and she turned immediately into a golden statue. In a panic, King Midas fled to Dionysius and explained to him what was going on. And he said, is there any way to reverse this wish? Is there any way to undo what's taken place? For this wish has now become a curse. And Dionysius said to go down to a particular river. This is the only way, but to wash in that river, and the curse would be reversed, or the wish would be reversed, and anything that's been touching in that water also, it would be undone. And so he goes and he grabs his daughter. Now remember, she's a statue at this point, just a golden statue. And he takes her down to the river and he dips in the water with his daughter there also, and she is restored to her living condition, and the wish is undone. And only after the wish is undone is King Midas happy again. What is interesting to me about this story of King Midas is that in our modern times, when we use the phrase Midas touch, we mean it in a positive way, right? For example, if somebody just has a knack for making money, and it seems that no matter what venture they find themselves in, everything seems to turn out well and he makes a profit, we'll say, boy, he just has the Midas touch, doesn't he? Everything he touches turns to gold. Or if somebody maybe has nothing to do with money, but every project they undertake, every adventure they get on, it turns out well. And you might say, well, I want her to lead it because everything she does turns out well. She just seems to have the Midas touch. And we mean it in a positive way. But when you trace it to its origins, the idea of the Midas touch is really a curse. Because when your life begins to revolve around materialism and money, it destroys everything around you, including the people you love. And this rich man, in verse 20, after he's taking such delight in his wealth, God says to him, "You fool, tonight your soul will be required of thee. And then whose shall these things be which thou hast acquired?" In the Jewish Talmud, which is a set of Jewish writings, there's a statement that says that man is born with his hands clenched. Man is born with his hands clenched, and he dies with his hands open. Entering the world, man desires to grasp everything. But leaving the world, everything he has slips away. And this is why this rich man was such a fool, at least in part, is that he looked at this world as an idol, and his whole life was wrapped up in his wealth. There's a second reason why he was such a fool. Not only did he have an idolatrous regard for the world, but he also had an utter disregard for God. A couple of pieces I want to add to this is that in his disregard for God, he ignored his responsibility to him. If you read this parable, one of the things that will probably stand out to you is that he doesn't acknowledge God in any way. At no point does he say that God has bestowed upon him his wealth. At no point does he recognize that God has given him the ability or the wisdom or the wherewithal to acquire what he has. He gives no glory to God and no acknowledgement to God's role in his great wealth at all. In fact, in verses 17 to 19, those are just 3 verses, the first personal pronoun, I and my, are used 11 times in just 3 verses. 11 times. He talks about my wealth and what I have done and what shall I do, and this is what I will do. And it's all wrapped up in him. And he doesn't acknowledge God's role in his life at all. And all of us as stewards ought to acknowledge that anything we have comes from the Lord's hand. And we don't have to be wealthy to recognize that. Everything comes from God. When I was an associate pastor in Newton Falls, Ohio, there was a woman in our church named Arlene. And she and her husband Gerald were very faithful members of our church. They were there anytime the doors were open and very faithful to the Lord. And they've gone on to be with Christ in heaven now, but just wonderful, wonderful people. Arlene had a sister named Liz who was extremely wealthy. She had made $1 million a year over several years in real estate. But she wasn't a Christian. She never went to church, never acknowledged God. And she said to Arlene one time, she said, I worked hard for my money. God didn't give it to me. Very blunt, very straightforward. That's how she felt. That it was all her. I was in a conversation recently with someone about, when we do something that's good, is it us or is it God, right? That's a good question, because obviously we do put forth effort in things. But ultimately, my response is there's a bit of mixture of both in that, but ultimately, the glory goes to God. Because God gives us the ability to do all things. I often go back to Acts 17:28, where it says that in him we live and move and have our being. And I've always taken that verse to mean that we can't even breathe without God. We can't even get out of bed without God. We can't work without God. He gave us the brain to work. He gave us the energy to work. He gets the blood flowing through our body. Everything. We couldn't do anything without him. There is a sense where, sure, it builds our confidence and gives us some reassurance in knowing that we disciplined ourselves to accomplish some task. And it helps us in future endeavors to know that God can work through us in that. And so there's nothing wrong with us feeling good about things that we're able to accomplish and successes we're able to have in life. But in the process, always recognize that you couldn't lift a finger without Almighty God giving you the ability to do so. And so all glory and thanks should go to him. Every bit of it. And say, Lord, thank you. And so this rich man, he didn't acknowledge God at all. He didn't recognize his responsibility. And the last little part is that he ignored the question of eternity. He ignored the question of eternity. And this is tragic. And I know this is a parable, but I tell you, it represents multitudes of people who have lived and who are living right now. Here this man had worked so hard, and he was good at what he did. And he had accumulated so much wealth. But then the stunner comes. See, verse 20 is the kicker. Because verse 19, he's talking about what he's going to do with everything and build greater barns. And he said, I'll eat, drink, and be merry. So apparently, I'm guessing that this man was not ill. And he was not of an old age where death was imminent. He was probably maybe even the prime of his life. Because there's no indication here that he's expecting death at all. He said, I have much stored here for many years. So what shall I do? So he's apparently in good health and expects to live a long time. And so that's why verse 20 is the kicker. God comes to him and says, you fool, tonight, can you imagine? Tonight, your soul will be required of you. In other words, you're going to die tonight. And now whose will these things be? You see, he ignored the question of eternity. Didn't think about what he was going to do when this life was over. Didn't think about where his soul would go when he died. Didn't think about the condition of his soul. All he cared about was his money. The lady I told you about a little while ago, I want to go back to that story about the couple in our church in Ohio, Arlene and Gerald. They lived very modestly, the two of them. In fact, there were times they could barely afford their own medications. But again, Arlene's sister, Liz, was very wealthy, a millionaire. And Arlene told me one time she was talking to Liz about her soul, about becoming a Christian, about coming to Jesus. And this is what Liz said to Arlene. She said, "Sis, God is okay for you, but I don't need him. I have money. I have everything I need. I don't need God." That is one of the most heartbreaking things I have ever heard. To be that upfront, you got to admire her honesty, I suppose, but to rely that much on money and to think that when you stand before God, that money is going to deliver you from your sins and get you a place in heaven. It's just beyond my imagination. And I thought about Proverbs 11 and verse 4, where it says, "Riches profit not in the day of judgment, but righteousness delivers from death." And so when you stand before God, according to the Scriptures, your money, whether you have a little or a lot, isn't going to do you a bit of good. In fact, it won't even be there with you. And even if it was, it wouldn't have anything to do with your righteousness. Riches profit not in the day of judgment, but righteousness delivers from death. And how do you get righteous? Through Christ, through Jesus. People can save money, but money will never save people. And so what are you trusting in? What are you trusting in? This isn't a question of whether you're rich or poor, whether you've been blessed financially or not. That's not the issue. The issue is your attitude toward it. You could have very little and be full of greed. You could have a lot and be the most sharing individual on earth. The question is our attitude toward it. So let's not be like this rich fool who wrapped his whole life around his money and gave little consideration to God. But let's humble ourselves and put our focus on our relationship with Jesus, and then use our funds the way he would lead us, and be stewards of those things to his glory. Will you stand with me as we pray? Lord Jesus, we're grateful today for how you take care of us. And we